Alright, here we are at topic 6, graphing trig functions. So I'm just going to jump right in. Number 41, to graph negative sine of 4x. Our amplitude is 1, so we're going to have a standard height, and our period is going to be 2 pi over 4, which is pi over 2. So between 0 and pi over 2, I'm going to go through, so here's pi over 2. I'm going to go through one full cycle. So I know that the sine wave goes up, it's back to 0 and down again. So that's what my one full cycle looks like. If I'm doing it the way we did in class, so that's a full cycle of the traditional sine wave, the parent function. In that amplitude. The reason why we create the table is because when we have this a value here, it kind of throws things off a little bit. So if I'm going between 0 and pi over 2, and I cut it in half, I have pi over 4, pi over 8, and 3 pi over 8. So that just tells me where these little marks are that I made. And my parent function is 0, 1, 0, negative 1, 0. This helps me remember I've got to multiply by negative 1 to find my y values. So my zeros are still in the same place, but 1 times negative 1, this helps me remember to do the reflection. So my actual curve for my answer is going to look like 0, negative 1, 0, positive 1, 0. So this pink curve is actually my solution. So the reason I've taught you guys to make the table, and the reason I make the table, is I catch myself making mistakes with the reflection. So there it is. That's your curve. Alright, so now we have a tangent function in number 42. We remember tangents have no amplitude, and I'm going to go ahead, and secant doesn't have amplitude or cosecant either. So I'm going to go ahead and mark those while I'm at it. So to find my period of the tangent function, I'm going to do pi divided by 2/3. So remember, the formula is different for tangent. Pi divided by 2/3 is 3 pi over 2. And then I'm going to split that in half, and half of it's going to be on one side of the axis and half will be on the other side. So when I do my table, I'm going to go from splitting this in half, that's 3/4. So I'm going to go from negative 3/4 pi to positive 3/4 pi. In the middle is 0, and then between 0 and negative 3/4 is negative 3/8 and positive 3/8. And so, and actually knowing these numbers is not as important as being able to visually split it up. So here's my, well, let me go ahead and fill in the parent function. So for tangent, the parent has undefined at the ends, 0 in the middle, a negative 1, and a 1. And so when I'm multiplying that by the 2, I still have my undefined at the ends. So at 3/4 and negative 3/4, that's how I know I'm going to have an asymptote. So I'm sketching those in. And then I'm going to put my 0 in the middle. And when I multiply by negative 1 and my 1 times the 2, I get negative 2 and 2. So here in the middle, and I'm just visually splitting this in half. So the fact that I know it's 3 pi over 8 is fine, but really I just am splitting the region. So I'm going to go up to a 2 here, down to a 2 right here. And if I had some smooth jazz, I would play it while I graph my smooth curve. But I don't. So there we go. That's one cycle of the tangent curve. Now let's do our secant. And so let's go and find the period. So secant is related to cosine. So I'm going to go 2 pi divided by 8/3. And I'm going to keep switch flip. So I'm going to go 2 pi multiplied by 3/8, which is 6 over 8, which is 3/4 pi. or 3 pi over 4. So one whole cycle will happen in 3 pi over 4. So that's from 0 to 3 pi over 4 right there in 3 little squares of the graph. So I'm going to go ahead and make my endpoints. I'm sorry, I'm squishing everything in here. From 0 to 3 pi over 4 is going to be one cycle. So halfway is 3 pi over 8. Halfway there is 3 pi over 16. And then to find this last point here, I'm going to do 3 pi over 16 plus 3 pi over 8. That's 9 pi over 16. So I'm going to squish that in. 9 pi over 16. And I'm going to do my cosine curve. So I'm going to do the cosine parent. So that goes 1, 0, negative 1, 0, 1. And then to get the cosine curve, to get the y values, I'm going to multiply everything by 3 halves. So that's 3 halves, or 1.5, 0, negative 1.5, 0, 1.5. So here's 1.5, here's negative 1.5. So I'm starting up, I'm ending up, halfway in between, I'm all the way down. So halfway between those, I've got my zeros. So smooth jazz is playing, I'm graphing. So there's one cycle of cosine. Now I'm going to draw in my asymptotes at the zeros. And then at my peaks, I'm at 3 halves. So at my valleys, I'm going to be at 2/3 for the secant function. So I'm just going to go right here. And I'm going to do secant. And here's 2/3. And then here's 2/3. So the blue portion there is my secant curve. And last but not least, I'm going to do the cosecant. My period is 2 pi over 2, which is just pi radians. So I'm going to be graphing my parent, not my parent function, but my related function is the sine curve with cosecant. And I'm going from 0 to pi. So halfway is pi over 2, halfway there is pi over 4, and here's 3 pi over 4. So my parent for sine is 0, 1, 0, negative 1, 0. My y values for sine is going to be 0, 3, 0, negative 3, 0. So I'm squishing everything in here between 0 and pi, and here's my markings. So I'm going to go up to 0, 3, 0, negative 3, 0. So there's my sine curve. And then my cosecant curve is going to be, so the reciprocal of 3 is 1/3. Oh, I better make some asymptotes. So there's, at the zeros is my asymptotes. So then here's my cosecant. Here's 3, here's 1/3. So there's my cosecant. All right, I'm going to go ahead and do these graphing problems as well. So we've got cotangent, which I'm really just, I don't have to graph it. I'm just looking at the equation to find the results. Cotangent, I know, has no amplitude. The period is going to be pi divided by b, and there's no b value here, so pi divided by 1 is just pi. My phase shift is pi to the right, because that's my h value. My vertical shift is up 3. And so my midline, normally it would be at 0. My midline, the equation for that is just y equals whatever k is. So I'm going to write that y equals 3. Next section, I've got cosine, so I do have an amplitude. My amplitude will be whatever A is, so that's going to be 5/2 or 2.5. And my period, I'm going to use my period formula. And so that's going to be 2 pi divided by 2/3. So I keep switch flips, so I'm going to flip it and multiply by 3/2. So 2 times 3 is 6 divided by 2, and I get 3 pi. My phase shift with a plus h, I'm going to go left 3/4 pi. My vertical shift is down 1, and that makes my midline go down 1. So that'll be -1. And that's it for graphing trig.